Hi, everyone. I apologize for being 5 minutes late. I've been meeting with students and they're a little panicked at this time of the year. But anyway, here I am. And welcome to Hopkins at Home, as Will said, and to part 2 of our close reading of the Odyssey. And I wanted to back up to my first slide, which is not agreeing with me, so it's not showing. So it's just showing our introductory, the pantheon, the meeting of the gods on Olympus. And it is an unnecessary slide. So there were a couple of questions that came up in the chat last time that I did not have time to answer during class. One of them was, when was the first Latin translation of the Odyssey? And unfortunately, the answer to that, as to many questions that have to do with the Odyssey, is we don't know. But this is one of the extant early translations of the Odyssey. This is not the first printing, obviously. It was in manuscript. There have been many Latin translations of Homer over the centuries, but the oldest surviving one is this one by, it seems to be this one by Leontius Pilatus from the 14th century, which is pretty late. So do some searching, you may find an earlier one. Will, my slideshow is not moving when I push the arrows.
See, the arrows on your keyboard, is that what you're pressing?
Yeah.
Okay. In the meantime, there are arrows in the
bottom
left.
It works if I touch the slide.
Oh, great.
I don't know why. Let's just go with the flow here.
Works for me.
So, and this is another source, a late antique illuminated manuscript containing fragments of Virgil's Aeneid and the Georgics. So it's got a few more elements of the, and this is a much earlier one, and it seems to have earlier elements, but it's not complete. But I thought you'd find that interesting. And I thought that given the tenor of the questions we had last week, that the group would be curious about where these manuscripts came from, how they survived or did not survive. You probably all know some of the story of the library at Alexandria, which Julius Caesar apparently set on fire, but it was not the conflagration that has historically come down. It wasn't one mammoth fire that destroyed all the books. Many books were destroyed. There was a fire, but also there was a cutback in funding. It seems astonishing to think of that. There were between 40,000 and 400,000 books. Estimates vary. And I should not say books. These are manuscripts, papyri, and clay tablets that were in it. Interestingly, some of the remains that we have today were the temporary clay tablets that were used to make what they thought were the more permanent records. So there's a lot to read about the library in Alexandria. I just thought I would throw this in. It's probably going to lead to more questions, so put them in the chat box. Also, there were questions about a little more information about the epithets and our discussion of translations. So I made this slide just as a quick illustration of how epithets get submerged in translations that are trying to capture the poetic sense of the original. And these are two that came up in discussion. They're both very good reading. They tell, and they don't, I've looked through them both again this week. They don't distort the story. They simply submerge the epithets. And what do I mean by this? the Wilson and the Fagles translations are poetic translations. So here's Lattimore: long-suffering Odysseus slept in that place in an exhaustion of sleep and weariness. Long-suffering Odysseus is the epithet. Ba sanismeno Odysseus. It fits right into the meter. Emily Wilson has changed it to Odysseus had suffered, and that he had long ordeals. So she sort of splits it in two and pulls out different thoughts that it could be referring to. Robert Fagles has changed it to storm-tossed Odysseus and borne down by his hard labors. So those are poetic interpretations of the epithet long-suffering Odysseus. Lattimore has long-suffering Odysseus. So if you're, it's a choice. And if you are interested in watching the mind of the oral poet at work, as the poet slots in an epithet that will fit the meter of the line, and also give a trait to his character that stays with the character, regardless of whether the character is demonstrating that trait or not. Sometimes long-suffering Odysseus is called that when he's sleeping in a very comfortable bed, but it reflects to his larger essence, let's say. So write your questions down. I'm happy to talk more about this. And another thing to remember is that the epithets disappear. By the time of the Roman Aeneid, they were just decorative touches. The poet was not an oral poet and was not aware, we wouldn't be aware until the early to mid 20th century of the functional use these epithets filled in being memory aids to the oral poet. With the advent of print, almost all oral poetry disappeared. That went backward. Okay, I think we're all right now with the slides. And so I've put a slide in here for you. I will not read the whole thing, but in my second paragraph, thoughtful Telemachus is the kind of person who thinks things over carefully, whether he seems to be doing that in a given moment or not. I sometimes think of them as nicknames, but you find a mental hook to hang these on. They're unfamiliar to us. And then I'm going to point tonight to an episode in which the epithet is doing a more functional job. So they do serve as little triggers to the reader, the listener, also about, wily Odysseus, clever Odysseus. There are various epithets that trigger in the listener the idea that Odysseus is up to something. And there's a moment in the reading for today when Odysseus is quite definitely up to something, and it's amusing and it's fun to watch it in action. I've already talked about that. And there's that slide again. All right, so getting back to the text then, this was why I had started with the Council on Olympus. Last week, we talked mostly about Telemachus's travels and his visits to the Trojan heroes to see. One reason for those visits was to get him out of Ithaca while the suitors were after him. But the other reason is that he was learning proper guest host behavior, how a well-run household functions. And we'll see a little bit more of that tonight too with Odysseus. But so we're back to that same moment, right? After the council decided what to do, we followed Athena. Hermes, as I showed you last week, went to the island of Ogygia, where Odysseus is being held, and told the sea nymph Calypso that it was time to let her lover go. So that all was put into play. And here's the painting. I may have showed you this before, of Odysseus weeping by the shore right before Hermes comes with his message. And this is just a review. So I just went over the books 1 to 4 for Telemachus. Now books 5 to 8 are going to track Odysseus's encounter with the Phaeacians or Phaeacians, who will ultimately bring him home to Ithaca. While he is there, in books 9 to 12, he tells the stories of his adventures. And then in books 13 to 24, which we will get to next week, Odysseus and Telemachus, the threads of their adventures unite, and they are both back in Ithaca. Odysseus will gradually reveal himself to Telemachus first before he reveals himself to anyone else. And then books 13 to 24 involve the identification of allies, the recognition scene with Penelope, which is always a lovely scene to talk about, the retribution against the suitors, an interesting vignette of the suitors in Hades, and the resolution of further retribution attempts. I know I went over this last week, but I thought it would be helpful. And this week, since we are going to follow through the first half of Odysseus's account of his adventures, I thought I would put this back up again just to remind you that although Odysseus claims to be telling, these are stories he is telling to the Phaeacians, it may be that he's got a certain end in mind. I will try to follow what seems to be his plan for what he hopes to get from his new hosts. So if you look at this in terms of the outer circle, the blue circle being not the 10 years of Odysseus's travels, but the period in which he is in Phaeacia telling the stories of his travels to them, it covers about the same 30 days between when he tells the stories in Phaeacia to when he returns to Ithaca. The same period of time is involved for Telemachus's journey to visit Pylos and Sparta, and Penelope's holding the fort after the suitors have discovered her weaving strategy. Another useful aspect of this slide is it tells you what order things happen in. I refer to it a lot just to keep myself focused. So do with it what you will, it's there for you. Another aspect of that circular structure on the slide is that it's a reminder, it's an illustration of the ring structure of oral formulaic poetry that I'll go back to it. Yes, I can do that now. One story spins off another, but they're all following the same plot. The little trip to Hades that happens, it's at the bottom of this slide. Odysseus is visiting Circe on Aiaia. So there are two goddesses on two islands. Circe, the visit to Circe on Aiaia, which if things go well, we will reach that tonight. That involves a trip to Hades and then a return to Circe. And then Odysseus can go on and have the second half of his adventures, ending with the island of Calypso on Ogygia. So that second half of the outer blue circle is what we will go through next week. This is the worksheet that I sent out last week. And I look forward to getting some feedback from you tonight in our discussion section about whether you found this useful exercise or not, what I'm going to do or how I could make it different and perhaps be more helpful. Right now, I just want to run through it quickly. This is the same text. I've just broken it down and point out some things to notice. So Odysseus has just managed to drag himself from this stormy ocean. His departure from the island on his way to trying to get back to Ithaca, he leaves in a perfectly functional boat, but Poseidon has returned from his visit to the Ethiopians. And he finds out just in the nick of time that Odysseus is back out on the ocean and sends a storm. So it's been a terrible storm. The boat is destroyed. Odysseus has been thrown 3 times at the shore and has been dragged back in by the waves. And if you've ever been body surfing and have had that experience, you know that it's a force to be reckoned with. So he kisses the ground, and he's quite worried. He's worn out, and it's evening. And he worries that if he waits by the river, the female dew, and I've got a little note for you there about the classical theories of the 4 humors from Aristotle and Galen, so you can read that. He worries that it will get too cold. Men, according to the humors, are warm and dry, and they can't have that sucked out of them by too many feminine qualities. So Odysseus goes up the slope. This is what he decides to do. So that what I was pointing to there is the logical structure. The text, the separate passages of the Odyssey are very logically laid out in terms of syntax. Then, deeply troubled, Odysseus says, then he says, for on the one hand, if I wait, but on the other hand, if I go. And so he sets out his options very clearly. The Homeric poet sets them out clearly. In the division of his heart, this last way seemed best. That's a formulaic phrase. Odysseus often ponders in his heart. Actually, he ponders in his thumos or liver, which is where the Greeks felt the seat of emotion and knowledge was. But he ponders, that's good enough. And he went to look in the wood. He decided that was a better choice. And guess what? He finds a perfect shelter of 2 shrubs, one of wild olive and one just a wild shrub. And they are interpenetrated or interwoven. Nothing can penetrate them. The wet blowing winds can't get through. The shining sun can't get through. Even the rain can't get through. This is not natural, right? Something has caused this structure to be right where he needs it. Who could that be? Well, when he does lay down, Athena is going to be the one who puts him to sleep as usual. But first, he makes his own bed. And this has interested students of the Odyssey for centuries. There was room in the shelter and enough store of fallen leaves for 2 men, maybe even 3 in the winter season to shelter. What is the reference to 2 or 3 men? I'm not sure. As you continue reading, you may have your own thoughts. So long-suffering great Odysseus was happy. Now he really is long-suffering Odysseus, right? And he piled leaves to be warm. And here is a Homeric epithet. We haven't talked about those yet, but this is a lovely epithet in my view. As when, so that the as signals that here's an analogy being made. And did I say epithet? This is a Homeric simile. I'm so sorry. This is a Homeric simile. And often there's a twist in them. And there's an interesting twist in this one. So just as when a man buries a burning log in an ash heap, if no one else is around and he wants to save the seed of fire, so that's a common enough image if you've ever used a wood fire or gone camping and want to be able to start the fire up again without lots of newspaper and matches, which weren't handy for Odysseus. But we're in an analogy. Who's the seed? Whose seed is he saving? You know, who's almost burned out here? There's no actual fire. It's Odysseus who is worn down to his lowest denominator. And when we get to his visit to Hades to hear the prophecy of Tiresias, this will be made much more clear to you. So let's just hold that in store. But for now, so Odysseus buried himself in the leaves. And I want to move back up because I skipped something. Odysseus entered the shelter and with his own hands heaped him a bed to sleep on. This is another formulaic phrase, although it doesn't occur too often. When they do go to Hades, they will lose one of their sailors, simply because he's simple, Homer says, and he'd been sleeping on the roof, and when the call came that they had to make a trip to Hades, he'd been sleeping on a roof of the shelter they were in on Circe's island, and he forgot that he was on the roof and stepped off the side. Poor thing. So when they came back, they had to bury him. And this formulaic phrase is used for the burial. So there are many little cues here to tell us that this Homeric simile is referring to the fact that Odysseus himself is on the edge of his resources. He buries himself as though he were a spark that needs to be kept alive. And then Athena steps in and puts him to sleep. At the same time, it can be in more than one place. Athena gives a dream to the daughter of the king of the island. King Alcinous has a daughter named Nausicaa, of whom you may have heard something. And Athena gives her a dream in which Nausicaa thinks she is dreaming that she really must. She's of marriageable age, and she must get up in the morning and wash the family's clothes, so that with her coming wedding, they will all have appropriate things to wear. She doesn't have a coming wedding yet, but it happened the way things happen in dreams. So this is from a vase painting. The pictures I'm showing you as we go along, I have tried to take from the earliest sources I could find, but my objective here is also to give you a sense of how the Odyssey continued to have an impact on contemporary culture through the centuries. So I'll try to point out where they're from. Generally, I have that information on the slide, but these early vase paintings are not really datable. And this is a copy of a painting on a vase, although I have some actual vases. Here is one. This is the next morning when Nausicaa has gone to wash her clothes. And it just happens that the beach where she and her maidens go is right outside the shelter of Odysseus. You must read the passage in which Odysseus emerges from the shelter. He hears them, but he has no idea who they are. It follows on the close reading passage that you had for tonight. He hears them, he has no idea who they are. He's in there naked, he's got nothing. He doesn't know if they're witches or goddesses or human, he has no idea. So he comes out like a lion. He's ready to attack, like a hill-kept lion whose belly is flapping because he's so hungry. He's in attack mode. And as I imagine it, he's in mid-leap. He's in mid-leap coming out of the shelter because he doesn't know what's out there. He can't see anything. Remember, that place is tight. And he sees that they're young maidens with well-kept hair, and he suddenly transforms. He's no longer attacking. He's got to find a way he grabs a bush to cover himself up a little bit because the base is trying to show you that it looks like an inadequate piece of cover, but that's what he does. And then he changes. The man of many ways pulls out a pleasing personality and a kind of seductive charm. So you'll enjoy reading that. The very next day, and you can follow the steps he takes to do it, Odysseus is now a guest at the court. If we go back to the Nausicaa slide, this encounter with Nausicaa, as Odysseus comes out of his shelter, he not only sees the young women who are dressed a little more like flappers than like Greek maidens, but but this is an early vase, so I'm not quite sure. This may be an imitation, but it doesn't really matter. The other thing he sees is the clothing that they're watching. He's collecting data. He's a data collector. I find it easy to translate this scene into a modern movie in which there's a superhero who's got computerized vision, and it clicks through all the things the data that he can take in the moment, or she. We have heroines also with computer vision. So he takes it all in. And instead of attacking them, which he could have done and taken the clothes and gone to get a job on a boat off the island, he recognizes that she must be a daughter of a high-placed person, and that the clothing is not ordinary clothing. And so he takes all that in and plans accordingly. So as I said, by the next day, he's a guest in the court, and he's got another plan now. I've got to move something which is covering up the text. He is being entertained in the court with games and competitions. And Laodamas, who's the son of King Alcinous, invited Odysseus to compete in the games. And he seems to do it fairly politely. This is in book 8, and you can read it when you get time and see what you think. But Odysseus is going to turn his words upside down. He says, Laodamas, why do you all urge me on in mockery to do these things? I think Laodamas is now scratching his head thinking, what have I done? This is my father's guest. But Odysseus is now, the epithet being used for him oh dear. Okay. Will and I will have to have a consult between now and next week to see what's going wrong with my PowerPoint, but it's back on track now. So Laodamas is trying to understand how he offended his guest. Another young man in the court, a friend of Laodamas, Euryalus, speaks harshly to the guest. He's angry. He may spot what Odysseus is up to, but he's also young, and he's made fun of him. If you read the text, you'll see that he's made fun of him to other young men at the court. So this is actually the moment Odysseus has been waiting for, and you can follow what he says at lines 55 and following in book 6. The end result of this is that King Alcinous is going to rebuke Euryalus for his bad behavior. Euryalus will give a present to Odysseus to make up for that. And King Alcinous feels so bad that a guest in his court has been offended that he recruits 12 other lesser kings to give some significant gifts to Odysseus. And I want to talk about all of these gifts again when we do follow the visit to Hades and hear the prophecy of Tiresias, because part of the prophecy is that Odysseus will come back to Ithaca with nothing, having lost all of his ships and all of his men and all of his fortune, which is essentially true, except technically what he is given by the Phaeacians doesn't seem to count. That's new fortune, not old fortune. So he becomes a storyteller. He's very pleased, and he becomes now a teller of tales. This is a name that the Phaeacians will give to him. And this is, I could not get a better slide. This is the first adventure. If you go back to your, when you're reading, you can go back to one of my breakdowns of the books. But these are the Cicones or the Ciconians, as Lattimore says it following the Greek pronunciation. This is possibly a copy of a wall painting. It looks more Roman than Greek. Some of my slides will be from the Aeneid period, because Virgil, when he wrote the Aeneid, followed the incidents in the Greek epic, the Odyssey, very, very closely. So this one seems kind of Roman to me, but I think of this irreverently and critically as a refueling stop. After they leave Troy, after Odysseus and his men leave Troy, the nearest island is just an ordinary island, a civilization, and they pick a fight. They raid the island, they take the women. It's not nice. So this is the first stop. The next one is the lotus eaters. I could not get a good illustration of the lotus eaters, but here's some lotus plants, or the closest people have come to identifying lotus plants. On this island, the only edible source of food are lotus plants, and they are also intoxicants. So the inhabitants are permanently intoxicated. And so this is the first threat to the homecoming. The men are going to forget their homecoming. This is clearly a Roman image, but this is Aeneas has sent his soldiers to bring the intoxicated sailors back to the boats. You can see up here in the right corner, lower right corner, a soldier with a helmet near the margin is pushing this soldier who's lost most of his armor while he's been eating lotus plants. And here's another one on the left, where two more. The soldier on the left has got neck locks on two and hair locks on two men. They don't want to come. They do not want to leave. They like the lotus plants. So they have to be brought back to the boats by force. There's another one on the far left, in the far left of the print. This is some sort of print being put into a boat. He looks like he can just be lifted and he's asleep. So the next adventure is the Cyclops. Now those first two stops are told very quickly. The Cyclops is going to get a lot of time and attention. I think you are all familiar with the one-eyed giant who lives on an island that Odysseus really should not stop at, but he does nevertheless. And this is another vase painting. I sort of assume everyone knows the story, but the way they finally subdue the Cyclops, the one-eyed giant, these are a race of beings who live alone. They trick him into, and they get him drunk and stab his eyes so that he can't see, and they sneak out of the cave that way. It's always a good story to read again. Not that I enjoy the way they subdue him. And you can see that he's holding in his hand, in his far hand, his right hand, a two-handled pitcher of wine. They've brought they've brought wine that's unmixed with water. It's very, very strong wine. The Greeks are always mixing water into the wine I think the wine served to disinfect the water, which they would pick up wherever they were. And also the water served to lessen the effect of the wine. So they give it full strength to the Cyclops, and eventually he falls asleep. Here's another. This is an amphora painting, a vase painting, which has been, through the magic of the camera, opened out, as though you opened out the vase and spread it out. So you see most of the picture here, Cyclops on the left and the Greeks. All right, so their next stop is the Aeolian island, the god Aeolus, the wind god. You will notice as you're reading that we sort of have two alternating kinds of threats to the homecoming. There's the threat of forgetting about your homecoming, which is represented first with the lotus eaters. The men would forget their homecoming. Then we had the, so there's the men who've forgotten about their homecoming, they don't want to go. Then we have the Cyclops who's going to eat them. The first thing Odysseus always does when they reach a new place is send his men out to look for eaters of bread to see if it's a civilized area. And sometimes, this is not the only time, they find eaters of men. Now there's another nice one. Aeolus, the god of winds, is very friendly to them. He wants to help them get home. But in this case, it's Odysseus's men. It's never Odysseus, but Odysseus's men disobey the wind god's request that they not open the bag of winds. He gives Odysseus a bag of winds to take him home, but he doesn't, but he says you can't open it. You just need to use it sparingly to push you towards Ithaca. And while Odysseus is asleep, the men decide they want to hurry things up, so they open the wind and get blown all across the Mediterranean. It takes a long, long time for them to get home. This is again a picture from the Aeneid. So there's a lot of symbolism of gods and goddesses. Basically, King Aeolus has 12 children, 6 daughters and 6 sons, and they are all married to each other. And here they are animated as Roman gods and goddesses, and lots of little added imagery. But it was a nice image. I thought you'd like to see it. And now they have another, this is the Laestrygonians in book 10 are another race of cannibals. And so they are exploring this island, which looks pretty normal until they discover that the people who live there like to eat other people. And so this is another high-risk adventure. And then there's Circe. Circe is, it's a wonderful story. And I'm going to give you for next week a passage, a close reading passage from Circe's island. Nothing is what it seems to be on that island. And this painting I found only recently, such appealing pigs. But half of Odysseus's crew is turned into pigs on this island. And I really want, the reason I'm picking this as a source of a close reading passage is I really want your thoughts on everyone's behavior. How does the magic of the island affect the behavior of the sailors, and of Odysseus himself, giving you a lot of pointers here. Circe is pretty intent, I think, on simply capturing all of them. But after she has only turned half of them into pigs, Hermes intervenes, sent from Olympus, of course, and gives Odysseus a magical herb, which he can use to trick Circe into not turning him into an animal of some kind. So that's all I'm going to tell you about that adventure. And then, as I said earlier, while they are visiting Circe, they have to make a visit to the underworld. And this is Tiresias. In the lower right corner is Odysseus, although this may be Aeneas, being depicted here. As I said, the same adventures occur. In the underworld, they sacrifice an animal so that there's blood, and the blood will call the spirits of the dead. And one of the spirits who comes to talk to Odysseus is his mother, the spirit of his mother, who has died in the 20 years that he's been away. Also the spirits of some of the Greeks who died in the Trojan War. So that's interesting, very interesting encounter with some of them. And we'll touch on those next week. And here for you, down at the bottom in my text box, is the prophecy of Tiresias. He has just told Odysseus that when they visit the island of the sun god, who loves his cattle, strange relationships between humans and animals in the Odyssey. Tiresias has said the sun god, Helios, will help you, but you cannot eat his cattle. If you do harm them, then I testify to the destruction of your ship and your companions. And if you yourself get clear, you will come home in bad case with the loss of all your men in someone else's ship and find troubles in your household, insolent men who are eating away your livelihood and courting your godlike wife. All right on the mark. That's exactly what he will find, except, as I just pointed out, he's a resourceful Odysseus is working out a workaround with the Phaeacians, who he has manipulated quite deliberately with that little encounter in which he stirs up what seems to be an attack on himself, and makes the king upset with his court. So we can talk more about that. And that is where I hoped to get to tonight.